welcome to my YouTube channel. If you have not been here before and you're just about to watch an hour of my content, then make sure that you subscribe. So you do me a favor, likes are great, comments are fantastic, but please do subscribe if you like my content. I release here every single Sunday. Today, I am going to be talking about a case that I really thought twice about doing, and I thought twice about doing it because it's really local to me and because I remember it like it was yesterday, and it literally happened minutes away from where I live. And also there was this weird synchronicity regarding the crime that played out, in the fact that my own son had problems with his lungs when he was a child, and so I would often be in the ward that eventually was dedicated to the young man who was murdered. And also my ex-husband actually worked with the individual that I'm going to be talking about. And on top of that, I literally still live around the corner from where all of this played out. And because of that, it feels really personal. And I don't want the family of the child that I'm going to talk about being murdered feeling that I haven't done them justice. I really feel that it's really important when I'm talking about these cases that I recognise that the people who have been impacted on as the family members, if they come across this, feel that I actually told the story in a way that was fair. So just putting that all out there, guys, because I think it's really important to do that. The story that I'm going to tell you is about a young man who was murdered called Joe Geeling. He was 11 when he was murdered, and he was killed by a boy called Michael Hamer. And the murder itself is horrific, but the reason I wanted to cover this case is because, firstly, it's incredibly close to home. Secondly, it reminds you that no matter how loved and safe and cherished a child is, that no matter how you protect them, how you make sure they're safe, how you literally live your life to keep them protected, there is always this tiny, tiny chance that no matter what you do, there is a predator lurking around that corner. And unfortunately, whilst this is incredibly rare, and let me always make that clear, particularly in the Western world, a child being murdered is unbelievably rare. But if you are that statistic, if you are that parent, if you have all the what ifs, because every parent who loses a child to murder has a list of what ifs, that statistic is obviously staggeringly real. And I just want to set that up before we kind of talk about what happened and who Michael Hamer was, and where he is now. And I also want to be able to talk about whether I genuinely believe that Michael Hamer could be rehabilitated. I think it's really important to try to be as balanced as possible, but I want that caveat in. I want the caveat in at the beginning of this that I do have these personal feelings towards this case because of my wider knowledge, and also because I remember the days that they had to close off the road near me because of where poor Joe's body was found. I remember feeling it as a mother because it's very close to home, because I even remember them closing the road off where I lived. That's how close to home this is. So I'm not going to make it in some kind of really dramatic timeline. I'm going to talk this through as it happened and also bring in my personal feelings. So please appreciate this is coming from a much more personal standpoint than my usual content, and I want to get that across before I start. So Michael Hamer was a problematic young person. He didn't stand out with respect at school particularly, and I want to be aware that this young man was, as far as he was concerned, very bullied at school. He'd had quite a serious wrist injury that had caused him some problems. He'd also had a half-brother who had died. So Michael Hamer's life was not ideal. And one of the things that we have to make very clear is that his mother, who actually used to work at a school I went to, see how strange this is, this kind of web that I'm weaving? But she had definitely tried to get her son help. In fact, she had been and spoken to social services about her child's mood. Michael was somebody that she saw was struggling, and he had this very, very problematic relationship with his father, who was a serving police officer. And his father didn't really see him. You know, I can put it however anybody would wish to, and you can go online and you can read the interviews with his dad. You can do that. And he'll talk about how he's ruined both lives, i.e. his own and Joe's. But I think a little bit of mention about responsibility, Dad. Kids need the fathers. Full stop. There's no point coming in after your kid's killed somebody and saying, oh, would have been helpful if he hadn't gone and murdered that child. That would have been helpful if you had been a father figure. I'm sorry that's very judgmental, but it's meant to be. I am so tired of hearing parents who come in after horrific crimes have occurred with their children and then blaming the child alone. Of course, Michael Hamer is fully guilty. But please do not do interviews saying how he could have done a better job as a human being when you didn't do a better job as a father. Very, very, very judgmental, but I do think we all have to take on roles and responsibilities very, very carefully in life, don't we? Anyway, there is a potential, what I just said comes from a triggered perspective, but I am quite tired of men who leave their children being really surprised when those children don't grow up great because they've spent their entire life with abandonment and attachment issues, wondering why they weren't good enough or worthy enough to be loved. But who am I to say? Just somebody who's had to pick up the pieces with many, many kids from parents who just walked away. And that particular individual walked away whilst his partner was pregnant. And that's okay. Leave your partner. You have an absolute right to. No one should be stuck in a relationship they don't like. Just don't leave your kid. Simple rule. Don't leave your child. Imagine how that would feel. None of this is an excuse for any of the things that play out and any of the things I talk about, but I just needed to make that point. I really struggle with people who get in the press after they did nothing to actually help the child that was obviously struggling very deeply. Michael Hamer was not somebody who stood out at school. He was not one of those individuals that you would have noticed because they were a bully or because they didn't necessarily do their work. He wasn't somebody that to any degree really was pointed out in a way that teachers would have recognised that he was being problematic. But as I go on to talk about the letter that he wrote to Joe, which kind of began this process, I will introduce you to the fact that the teachers did suspect that there was something wrong happening. I just want to put that out there. The school he went to is literally 5 minutes drive away from me. I've worked in that school. It's so strange having these conversations on YouTube with you guys because obviously usually I'm one step away from this, but I've actually worked in that school. I knew some of the teachers. So this really is very present for me, even though we're years down the line. And you'll be surprised when I tell you about the date set for the potential release of Michael Hamer at the end of this. So Michael didn't really stand out to any great degree. Joe, on the other hand, is somebody who really did. Joe Geeling stood out for so many reasons. One, his massive love of football. I mean, he was a real football fan. But secondly, he had cystic fibrosis. So cystic fibrosis is a disease that affects the lungs. That's why my son would be on the same wards that would be actually put in his name after his death. And cystic fibrosis is a degenerative disorder. It obviously is treated far better these days, and people even get lung transplants, but it's life limiting. And for Joe, he was constantly at Booth Hall Children's Hospital, as was I. It was a specific kids unit. It was a kids hospital completely, had an A&E unit and everything. You know, when the government used to fund kids hospitals properly in local areas, so, you know, you could take your child to an A&E and they could have specific paediatricians treat them, but who knew how out of fashion that would go in the last decade. But Joe would go there and he was so popular. He was popular everywhere. And I'm not saying this because this is a case of a child who's been murdered. I'm not trying to say this to ingratiate Joe further to you. You don't need me to. Just look at anything online about him. Look at people's narratives about him. I lived this situation. I saw the way that my community felt about the loss of that child. Incredibly close family. I mean, the closest, most loving type of family who dealt with obviously trauma of having a child who is sick, always going to appointments, making sure that he was kept safe. And what's really hard about this is that the day that he was murdered, his mother had actually picked him up from Booth Hall's Children's Hospital, where he'd been receiving overnight treatment for cystic fibrosis. And then she dropped him off at St. Gabriel's, which is a school that he went to that day. And that's really where our story begins. To all intents and purposes, Joe's day was completely normal. He had lots of friends, he went to his normal classes, he arrived in school a little bit later that day because of the fact that he'd been dropped off from school, and the day was playing out as you would imagine. So during a lunch break, Joe actually receives a letter given to him by Michael, but it suggests that it's been written by Linda Foley. It is handwritten. Now, we all know a deputy head teacher, Linda Foley, would not handwrite a letter. Just wouldn't happen. This is the letter word for word that Joe Geeling received off Michael Hamer. Joseph, you've heard, Year 10s have started to mentor Year 7s, and they've been told to take some books to understand the difficulties some people may be having. As you know, Michael is your mentor and will start next week. Unfortunately, Michael has got some of your books, but will be unable to return them to you for 2 months due to surgery. Just so you know, guys, he had a serious wrist injury, so he was recovering from that. So I've spoken to your mum and I've asked her if you could go with Michael to his house and collect them with the permission of his mother. I've given the address to your mum and she will meet you at his house at 4:30 p.m. tonight. Sorry for the inconvenience, Deputy Head L. Foley. And the letter ends with, do not, and the word not is underlined, discuss this with anyone else as this will cause confusion. Thanks. Sinister, right? So as you can see, this letter is meant to be from the deputy head teacher, Linda Foley. Even though that's handwritten and it's handed to Joe from Michael, Joe's gonna take it relatively seriously. You know, the letter suggests that Michael is his mentor and that he's got to go and meet his mother, Gwen. So he's actually got to go to Michael's house to get these books, to meet his mother, Gwen, and he's just round the corner because they live relatively round the corner from each other. So at 4:30, he was due to do that. Now, I know that all of you are probably thinking, why, Joe, why did you think that that might be real? And then I want you to go back to being a child. When I started high school, the girls in year 11, you know, at 16, I thought they were women. I looked at them like they were the most interesting, intriguing, curious beings. I looked at them with my braces and my terrible shoes, and I used to want to be them. They were just so grown and interesting and so not small and young and boring as I felt. So if one of those girls at 14 had come up to me and said, when I was 11, you know, come to my house later, I'm not even sure I would have needed to be handed a note. I just think I'd been like, that's rad that I'm going to be able to go to this person's house. That's cool that an older kid wants to hang out with me. I think so often we forget what it's like to be a child. You don't have the vision of an adult. You don't have the conscience of consequence. No, you don't. And your life isn't about worrying that there might be some predator, particularly a child. Remember, how often when you were a kid did you look at another kid a few years older and think, they may be my murderer? We don't teach children that children kill. We teach them that some crazy adults kill. When we hear about youth death, they're very clear to use words like youth, young person, right? They rarely say child. Children are anything to me under 18 easily, and under 16 definitely. We don't teach children that their neighbours or their friends might one day kill them. It would be too terrifying to do that. So we don't even equip the possibility for children to believe that potential predators can be within their own age frameworks. We don't expect that at school, right? And even though we know that 0.2% of people who are female are psychopaths and 5% of men are psychopaths, we know this, and we know that they grow up, therefore they born and grow through and become those people, and there are all these ingredients that create that, but nonetheless, we know this statistic. You don't just grow into a psychopath at 25. You're born it with a predisposition, and you grow it with the knocks and bumps and challenges and triumphs that actually impact on you through your life. And let's put it in this context. If you're a psychopath and you're born to a wealthy, well-adjusted family and you have money and opportunity, chances are you'll just go make millions as a trader, ruining everybody's lives that you work with. But you'll do fine. The only time you're going to end up in a criminal situation is when you don't have the opportunities that wealthy psychopaths have. So this isn't to do just with psychopathy. This is to do with opportunity in class. So just have that in your mind whenever I discuss psychopaths. It's really powerful when you start thinking of the world like that, because you can bet your bottom dollar you're working with one, or you're living near one, or you're even friends with one, because psychopaths are pretty good at being friends. They like to make sure that they get as much out of you as possible before throwing you to the wayside. So like I said, Michael Hamer is one of those individuals who definitely, when we go through this, has a huge predisposition for harm and a huge predisposition for internalized rage that is externalized. We'll come on to that a little bit more. But just think about the calculation at this point. If you think about what Michael Hamer is thinking, firstly, he knows what it's like to have been an 11-year-old kid. He knows what it's like to be 11. He's been bullied at school. He knows exactly what 11-year-olds think. He's been there. He knows what it would have been like to look at those older kids, maybe the ones who bullied him, and wish that maybe he could be part of that group. He has the intuition of that experience. I'm also going to acknowledge that Michael Hamer doesn't have the same lack of empathy to some degree when it comes down to experience, because we know bullying has desperately impacted on him. So therefore, he is an individual who has emotional experience. Again, important to note, does not deny any of what we're going to talk about in the future. But we always have to look at those ingredients. We know that Michael Hamer is broken. Psychopaths don't get broken. Psychopaths break. But that is why it's really important to remember that you don't just need to definitely be somebody with psychopathy to be somebody who is dangerous to be around. In fact, sometimes it can be even more dangerous to be around unstable human beings with a tenacity and ferocity for rage, because they don't give us any insight into that kind of behaviour until it's too late. Nevertheless, we can see that Michael has planned at least some of what's going to happen. We know that Michael Hamer wants to get Joe back to his house on his own. At this point, I suppose we could say Michael's desperately lonely. Michael wants to be friends with somebody more vulnerable than him. We know that Joe was not psychologically more vulnerable. Joe Geeling was psychologically more powerful than the majority of us because of the issues that he'd faced in his life. But certainly Joe was somebody who stood out as a human being, but with his physical vulnerabilities, Michael may have felt that he could take advantage of him more easily. But he's constructed this false opportunity so that Joe feels that he needs to potentially go, and maybe even wants to. Maybe he does, as I said, want to hang out with an older kid. Now later on that afternoon, and this is the part where my heart breaks. My heart breaks. He's having a history lesson, and because he's so popular, he's not stupid. He's had a conversation with friends about this letter, and they're all looking at it and talking about it, and they're huddling in this group saying that, obviously, Joe, don't go near this person. This is not normal. We haven't had any letters like this. And the teacher notices it. Joe shows the teacher that letter, but tells the teacher that the contents are secret. I have to commend the teacher. She actually says, Joe, nothing is that secret. Imagine if every single teacher said that to kids in so many different circumstances. Nothing is that secret. Like just that one opening opportunity that can change everything. So he shows her the note. It's written in red ink. Again, showing you that Michael Hamer has planned this, but isn't executing it in a way where he's covering his tracks. And she knows straight away it's not from Mrs. Foley. It's not signed in a way that it would be. It's handwritten. And she says to Joe, I want you to go to see the deputy head at break time. I want you to have a conversation and make sure that at the end of the day, you go straight home. So everything that teacher does is right. And actually, she goes and sees a more experienced teacher later on after that class to discuss those concerns. Because we always look for what could have been changed. And when the social services looked into this case, and they had to, I'll tell you about that in a little while, you've got to accept that in this case where the teacher is concerned, she was doing everything that she could. She was first advising Joe to go home. She was secondly seeking a more senior member of staff opinion, and she was also taking it very, very seriously and opening that conversation initially, and credit to her. Later on that afternoon, as advised, he is seen outside Mrs. Foley's office, and the teacher who he confided in has actually spoken to another teacher who's a history teacher, and they actually spot the fact that Joe is walking with Michael Hamer. Now, Joe is asked at this point directly, have you seen the deputy head? And what the teacher says is, Joe looked towards Michael Hamer as if to ask for approval and reassurance, and just says he had. He hadn't. But remember, Michael Hamer has been planning this. He'll have probably been checking on where Joe is. The moment he'll have seen him outside the office, the chances are he's going to have gone to intercept that situation. It makes sense. Hamer knows that if Joe Geeling has told people about this letter, that the chances are something is going to come out. And at this point, we don't know what's going to unfold. Does Michael know what's going to unfold? Certainly Joe doesn't. The head teacher, as I said, never saw Joe, which is a real shame, because we all know how this story would most likely have changed if that had been the case. Michael Hamer is asked by the teacher, are you the Michael that's referred to in the letter? And he does say yes. And this is something that just sticks in my throat to say. At this point, the fire alarm goes off. Can you believe it? At this critical point, the fire alarm goes off in another part of the school, and all the kids and staff are evacuated for a short period. Just sliding doors moments, you know? They were doing everything right at that school. They were doing everything right. They couldn't have done one other thing really, apart from potentially called Michael Hamer's mother and said what was happening. I think that should have been done, but they were dealing with the situation as it unfolded. And it clearly unfolded in a way where this interception of the teachers suddenly being blustered by this fire alarm, just totally transitioning that opportunity for change. So we know that Michael Hamer is staking Joe out to some degree. He must have been aware that Joe was waiting outside the deputy headmistress's office. We know that when he's stopped by a teacher with Joe, that there's been some kind of acceptance that Joe is going to go, as far as Joe is concerned, to Michael's house, because it's like, yeah, this guy has done it legitimately. This is Michael, my mentor. So there's clearly an awkwardness there where Joe and Michael are concerned, but also, again, that kind of sense that Joe feels that this is an older kid, so he's just going to kind of nod approvingly that it's okay. Because again, Joe is a kid. He's probably just thinking this kind of weird 14-year-old guy wants to hang out. He leaves school after the fire alarm has gone and that interjection's occurred, and him and his group of friends go to the Monkey Bridge, which is where when I was a kid I used to go. Everyone used to hang out smoking and having fun with each other after school and before school and during dinner hour, if I'm honest. It's literally where I used to go every single day with my mates. So that would like cross over to where there's a place called Bellevue Terrace. And then Joe tells his friends that he's hanging out with that he's going to go back to their shop. And it's like the sweet shop, I assume, because in Haslam Brow, there's this little sweet shop just near that bridge. And again, I used to go every single day with my mates and get a Diet Coke. So this is the world I lived in. You know, this is the steps that I used to take. He took the same ones. Now we know at 4:10 that day, one of the students does see Joe near to the Blockbuster video store, which was on Bolton Street in Bury. It's not there anymore, obviously. Blockbuster has gone, but used to take my kids there all the time to rent our videos. And that's not far actually from where Joe lived. And again, other students say that they did see Joe walking close behind Michael Hamer along Ainsworth Road, which is where my sister lives. So that's next to a park called Whitehead Park, where I spent my children's entire childhood, and just near Michael Hamer's home in Dalton Street. the fact that he's walking behind Michael Hamer, a part of me thinks that that shows that there was a reticence on Joe Geeling's part to go. A part of me also thinks that Michael Hamer didn't necessarily want them connected as far as other people witnessing them. But also it makes me question Michael Hamer's communication skills. You know, if you think about taking a young person back to your house for tea when you're a kid, you're kind of chatting, aren't you? You're having those conversations, you're talking about school. The fact that Michael Hamer and Joe Geeling weren't actually walking together demonstrates, if I'm honest, I think a lack of communication ability through Michael Hamer. And it maybe made Joe feel a little bit awkward, but now he's made that decision to go, he's just kind of going along with it. Again, because he's a kid. It's what children do. And to anyone who thinks that children don't do these kind of things, we have tested so many experiments where kids, you know, who are younger, who are told about stranger danger, have an adult go up to them in a park and just say, "You need to come with me," and the kids go. That's how easy these things happen. Because kids are not told, on the whole, that most adults could be predators, because most adults can't be, can they? So therefore they're used to believing that they can trust adults. So it's very, very normal for children to have a level of trust. And if you reduce that down, as I was saying earlier, to a child and another child, what are you thinking about? This is a bit awkward. Maybe I'll spend a couple of hours here, then I'll go home. Maybe I'll see whether his mum is there, or whether this is just something weird, and then I'll just leave. You know, he's trying to figure out probably why he's going, but still hoping that this is just going to be okay. When Joe Geeling gets to Michael Hamer's house, this is where things really start to unravel. And the part of me that's a mother, just the unpreparedness, even at the time when this happened, to know what happened still remains with me today. Because I know that a woman minutes away from me is going to hear the result of what happened next. And because I also know more about this story than probably most people do, just because of the relationships that I had that ironically ended up in me knowing about this child, me having Christmas cards sent from this child to my family. Yeah, I have a Christmas card of Michael because he sent it to my family from the secure unit that he worked. It just shows you, doesn't it, that anybody, any of us, we can all be affected by these kind of crimes, and they can find their way into our homes in the strangest of ways. Now, even though initially this didn't really come out in the press, this is very much sexually motivated. And it's hard to have conversations about children, isn't it, in that way? Particularly when we're talking about an 11-year-old boy who had no knowledge of this and was essentially walking to his doom. Michael Hamer basically goes with Joe, takes him to his bedroom, and essentially he makes a pass at Joe. That's what happens. He makes a pass at him. And Joe is nervous and doesn't want to be there, and is obviously starting to realise that things just aren't working out in any way, shape or form as he thought they would. And he just makes a comment about the fact that Michael must be gay. He also says, and I think this is really important to note, when you are a little child of 11 years of age, when you've got cystic fibrosis, you already have your vulnerabilities. Size was a vulnerability. So what ammunition have you got against this older kid? Well, the only ammunition that Joe really has in this moment is to threaten Michael, to say, you know, if you don't let me go, if you don't let me get away from here, if you carry on being weird, I'm going to tell people at school that you're gay. Now, that response, and it's in the press, you can read about it, that response makes perfect sense to me. That's Joe trying to leverage freedom. It's Joe trying to let him know that Michael hasn't got all the power. And to some degree, you have to understand that when you're a vulnerable child, you're going to be searching in that moment for anything. It's quite bright in many ways. You know, he's trying to figure a way forward. How do I get out of this situation? How do I get away from this guy? Michael Hamer said that was the trigger. That was the trigger. That at that moment, when Joe firstly refused and rebuffed his attention, and secondly, in his opinion, threatened that other people would be told about his sexuality, he explodes. His words, that he just explodes. And the way that he actually killed Joe was to take a very heavy-based frying pan and to smash him over the head and in the face around 10 times. It was with such force that the pan handle broke off. It fractured his eye socket, fractured his skull, damaged him unbelievably, but he's semi-conscious at this point. Michael Hamer then went downstairs and he got 3 kitchen knives, and then he stabbed Joe 16 times. 16 times. Now, there is a saying in psychology and in crime, overkill. Overkill is that scenario I've just described, where somebody is so enraged that they attack somebody with such ferocity that long after that person could survive, they continue. It's as if every piece of the puzzle of pain that they've carried turns into this toxic rage. And in that moment, they let every tiny bit of that toxic rage out. And in this case, this innocent, lovely, likable child is brutally attacked, brutally murdered. And this happens really quickly, guys. This isn't a situation where it's been a long, drawn-out scenario. This happens really quickly. What are my thoughts on that? My thoughts are that there is a strong possibility that Michael Hamer, pre-getting Joe Geeling to that house, was going to murder him. But I have a strong suspicion that he definitely wanted to sexually molest him. He had particular feelings towards his gender. He was uncomfortable with that. He wanted to express that to some degree. So he chose a child that he thought would be more physically strong than, that he felt that he would be able to sexually molest and even engage in some kind of sexual behaviour, even though that would still be molestation. But at that point where Joe refuses those attentions, that's when he uses it as an excuse to absolutely let rip his rage. And I know that any of you who've children, the idea of those last moments of a child who has already defied the odds in so many ways, it just feels doubly cruel. Murder is always horrific. Child murder is the worst thing that can happen. But when you have a child that has already gone through their years fighting and dealing with an illness like cystic fibrosis, having the personality and self-power to always be positive, and to have that stolen, to have that taken away with such ferocity, it's just terrifying. Michael Hamer's got a really short window of opportunity to get rid of Joe's body. So he gets the wheelie bin, wheels it to his back door, and he dumps Joe's body in it. Like in any situation, when somebody is acting outside normal behaviour, they get noticed. At 4:30, so we're talking like within the hour, this is all played out, a resident who's local to Michael Hamer sees him pushing the wheelie bin through the streets. I mean, immediately, you're going to be asking yourself, why is Michael Hamer, at this point in the day, wheeling a wheelie bin away from wherever he lives? It just doesn't make sense. And the thing about witnesses is they notice things outside of the ordinary. He turns left into Dalton Street, he goes down an alley, he cuts across a place called Newbold Street, and then he goes into Whitehead Park, where I have taken my children 1,000 times. And then in this park, there is this memorial, and there is a path to the memorial between the playground and the tennis courts. And he goes over to where there's a bowling pavilion. And again, another witness says that they noticed this, they quoted, spotty youth, about 5 inches tall, dragging a wheelie bin through the park, but really struggling with it. Hamer's seen by another witness trying to hide behind the wheelie bin when he's answering his mobile phone, and that was his mother. That's his mum calling him. So he stops the wheelie bin, he gets down on his mobile, and he has a conversation with his mum, and he basically says to her, yeah, I'll be home soon, I'm just out for a minute. After he's gone through the park, he arrives at this overgrown area and he dumps Joe's body and covers it with rocks, grass, twigs, foam, and old settee cushions. Just, it's very well concealed. So he knows where to go. Even if he didn't have this premeditated plan to actually murder Joe, it didn't take him long to imagine how he could conceal the body. He's obviously now seen pulling the bin back towards his house, but he's not struggling with it. So again, witnesses are going to notice that. It's really important to recognise that so often murderers, they think that they can outsmart people, but we are so wise to these kind of behaviours. If something looks odd, we just note it down. It gets burnt into our memory. I told you it's going to be a strange one this week because it is so close and personal. I've brought you to where Michael Hamer lived. So this is the street, Dalton Street, where Michael Hamer actually used to live, one of these houses here. Complete suburbia, right? 1930s, semi-detached, nothing out of the ordinary. Who'd have thought that something so horrifically extraordinary happened right here? And this is the walk. So after Michael killed Joe, put his body in a wheelie bin, he walks him down this alley right here. Cool as a cucumber too. Wasn't nervous. Almost like he prepared for it. Maybe he had prepared for it. I'm still on the fence about that. Did Michael Hamer intend to sexually molest, or did he intend to murder Joe? I guess that's something that Michael will know, and only Michael. Then takes a right. This is heading down for the park. This is literally where I used to take my kids after school, just the park that we're going to go to. But he wheels the wheelie bin down this alley. It's crazy thinking that this is the steps that a murderer took. He then takes a left onto Kingsley Street. I used to go to school with a lad, and there was a mate with a lad who grew up there. Massive house. Got his own recording studio and everything. And this is Whitehead Park. This is where I spent so many years with my children. This is why it's so close to home, because this is a place of safety, a place of happiness, not a place of hell. He wheels the bin through here. And you've got to remember as well, this is after school. So this is around, 4:15-ish, which means that this whole playground would have been full. Doesn't matter whatever the weather, there's always parents with the kids here. It's just the way it is. At the moment it's locked down, so everyone's freaking out still because, kids that are completely immune to a virus, let's still be afraid. But apart from that, there's a sensible parent over there letting the kids out. But it used to be full, it was always full. So he wheels the wheelie bin all the way down here. And there's a memorial. It used to be a proper memorial, but if you can just see in the distance over there, the wall that's raised. So my kids used to jump on and off that. It used to be one of their little fun expeditions when they were toddlers. But he brings him over here to where this memorial is. And this is the bowling green. It's where a lot of pensioners spend a lot of time bowling. It's very flat green, they're very proud of it. Probably hasn't been used that much. It's now a croquet club as well, which is weird because this is not a middle class area. I grew up, and I do grow up and remain in a very working class area. Now it's around here, things have changed a little bit. Everything's blocked off. But Joe Geeling's body would have been taken by the wheelie bin and dumped just around this area over here, which is near a car park, which again is why they weren't looking for a body at the time. So this was really the last kind of place that they'd imagined Joe Geeling to have been, because he had medication that he needed. He was in a situation where obviously he had cystic fibrosis. They were looking for a kid who was alive, just maybe gone missing, been sick. Little did they know that Michael Hamer had not just brutally murdered him, he'd really calculatingly disposed of this body. And that's one thing that you can't deny. 14 years old, literally minutes after finishing school, getting Joe back to his house, he murders him pretty instantly, really. And then he comes and disposes of the body here, making sure that it was covered with like a mattress, bricks, plants, you know, debris, just leaving him there cold. That's one of the things I struggle with. As a mother, you just want to know your child's safe, and if you knew that your child's body, albeit dead body, was in a cold park by itself, you just want to come and make him warm, wouldn't you? Can't imagine those hours and months after, knowing that gorgeous boy, that gorgeous young lad with that effervescent personality, with that incredible community connection, loved and cared for, not just by himself, by the people at Booth Hall Hospital, by his family, his friends, his school, but also all the people he impacted on, because he was one of those kids who did succeed in spite of his difficulties. It's crazy to think that this is somewhere that I spent some of the happiest days of my life, and that bastard tinged it. The amount of years that I've pushed my kids on that park, it's crazy. Isn't it crazy how something so remarkably a juxtaposition to what this place symbolises could become something that was so traumatic, so terrible. And I never ever fail to think about it when I drive past it, or occasionally when I'm here for whatever reason, even though my kids are older, you know, I find myself here sometimes. Just always sticks in my head. Always sticks in my head. It's really strange to think that after he dumps his body, covers that body up, he actually just wheels the wheelie bin back, goes home. Bad lighting in his house, so the stains of blood that he tried to scrub up didn't completely get scrubbed up, but nonetheless, you know, he was pretty efficient at knowing what to do. 14, and he knows how to clean up a crime scene, bleach everything. It's a really tough call to imagine the juxtaposition that you feel when you stood in front of this really innocent information board. It's got loads of information about the local area, what's going on at the croquet club, what's going on at the bowling club. It's so naive and innocent, isn't it? It's what we bring our children and communities to be a part of, because it's safe. And I guess that's the big thing, isn't it? You know, how many of us believe that we're safe? Most of us, right? You never know who's living next door. So, Michael Hamer, this is the route he took back. Just like an everyday experience. Walking home, his mum's calling him, asking him where he is. Cool as a cucumber, takes the call, just says that, you know, he's been a little bit busy. Goes back up the alley. So there you have it. This is where Michael Hamer grew up. This is where he lived. This is where he became one of the UK's most dangerous child killers. It's crazy to think that this year is the year that he might have got parole. Like I said, I haven't got the answers for that. I don't want to think that he'd be living next door to me though, would you? So, even though this is somebody who's just carried out his first kill, even though he may not initially have imagined that he was going to murder Joe, it really feels like he had a plan of what to do if that happened. I mean, it takes a huge amount of emotional disassociation to have just murdered an innocent child, and then to imagine that you will firstly put them in a wheelie bin to remove the body. Secondly, you will take them to a place where you can essentially cover that body, and then return home to just have an ordinary conversation with your mum before you start cleaning up the blood. So his parents, Tom and Gwen, are both obviously immediately concerned. He needs medical treatment to control his cystic fibrosis. So the fact that he's not gone home isn't just a call for alarm because they're worried about their missing child. It's something that can cause great harm to their child. So whatever is happening, their son not being present means that he can't get the necessary medical intervention. So immediately they ring the police because they need to have their child home. Joe does not go missing. He hasn't gone missing before this. And they immediately take it seriously. They don't say he might be with his friends. They don't say give it a few hours. And again, have to say that the police did it correctly. Very often we hear of cases where the police are hauled over the coals because, you know, they waited 24 hours to act, but this is immediate. They treat it with great concern. They organise searches straight away. And because of that, a number of staff at St Gabriel's are called back to go to the school and to the grounds because they want to look around that area. So these dots are getting put together very, very quickly. We have neighbours, friends, community members, the fire officers in the local area all searching for Joe. They don't find him early on. Temperatures are dropping. Joe's not a well child without the treatment that he requires. So they bring in the police, dog handlers, they bring in mountain rescue teams, volunteers. They get the helicopter of Greater Manchester Police because they need to find Joe. When Michael's mum actually gets home, she questions her son because one of the problems that she notices is there seems to be this like dark patch on the carpet, but the landing is really badly lit. And he actually suggests that he vomited blood. So she cleans it up. And then Michael Hamer does his RE homework. It's on the 10 Commandments. He has a bath and he goes to bed. You see, that's where I start questioning the psychopathy link. Because he may have been broken by his dad's abandonment. He may have been broken by bullying to some degree. He may have had an awful time not being popular. But the fact that he could just get on with his homework and that then he could go to bed, have a bath. I mean, just carry on as normal. That's devoid of emotion, isn't it? I mean, arguably one could say that he was in some kind of disassociative state, you know, completely shocked at his behaviour, numb even. But the planning and articulation of removing the body, to me, just reeks of somebody that has a very low conscience. The search party is still going ahead at this point. You know, we know that the relatives of Joe Geeling were actually literally walking feet away from where his body's buried, but they don't actually find him at this point. You know, they're not looking for a body, are they? That's the thing. This is a missing child, yes. This is out of character, absolutely. But are they looking for a body, or are they looking for a child who might be injured, might be distressed? So because of that, you know, upturning mattresses in parks and going through rubble probably isn't at that point what they're going to be looking for, because of course they're looking for a live child, a child in distress, a child who's injured, a child who's stuck somewhere. They're not looking for a body. It was a really cold time of year. I remember it well. In fact, it went below freezing those nights, and it went below freezing the night that they were looking for him. I just want us to take a minute to imagine how Joe's family would be feeling at this point. It's completely out of character. He needs his medical treatment. He's made no contact whatsoever. It basically means that they know something seriously wrong has happened, something seriously bad. I can't imagine how a parent can even exist in parallel with that experience, in parallel with that feeling, but they have to keep going, they have to keep searching. And then they start searching the school grounds, and obviously they're starting to ask questions, and this is mind-blowing. Because Michael Hamer just turns up at school as normal. Just goes on about his business. The same morning that Michael Hamer has gone to school as normal, their police dog and its handler are looking for scent around Whitehead Park, and that's where they find Joe, in a shallow grave essentially. At that point, all the tape goes up. I remember driving past it and it just being mind-blowingly obvious that something terrible had happened. I can remember thinking that maybe a rape had happened, because that's often been the case where I've gone past scenes or there's been a stabbing, but to no degree did I imagine that Joe had been murdered in such a horrific way and that things were going to play out as they did. Immediately, forensics are called in. Obviously, they need to examine the poor boy's body, and at that point it's obvious that a murder has occurred, and they launch a murder investigation. Now, obviously, now a body has been found, the police are looking for a murder suspect. So they're going to be questioning anybody and everybody who has been seen with Joe, and Michael Hamer has been seen the day before with him. Michael Hamer is actually ironically in an RE lesson when he's taken and questioned by the deputy head, Adam Loster. Now, Michael Hamer has had a certain amount of hours to start processing his alibi. Of course, it's what you're going to do. So he comes up with a relatively good one. He says, yeah, I saw Joe on Ainsworth Road, I had a brief conversation with him, but then I walked off and went home. But teachers become really concerned because he keeps changing his story, and they know the history. They know that Michael Hamer gave Joe a note inviting him to his home. They know that Joe had been seen with Michael, and this teacher had even questioned Joe on what had gone on. So Michael is aware that people are going to be aware of this situation, but he's obviously feeling that he can deflect it. Teachers, again, do the right thing. They're concerned. They're worried about Michael Hamer's changing stories, and they're starting to become deeply concerned that this is not an innocent situation, that they may indeed not be dealing with a 14-year-old school student. They might be dealing with a murderer. What hurts me is that one of the things that's really painful to imagine for both parents, the school teachers, for everybody involved in that situation is, whilst Michael Hamer is being questioned at school, Joe's body is left in the freezing cold. You know, this child, his body is just left in the freezing cold because forensic officers need to absolutely get every piece of evidence. Remember, they've got a murder that's happened. They need to make sure that they're going to be able to create an opportunity for somebody to be brought to justice. So every single item has to be removed that's covered his body. But that means that everyone in my area knew that a child's body was just left in the freezing cold. And I just think about his mother wanting to go and wrap him up. I just know that that's how she'd have felt. Detectives don't take long. They obviously put the pieces together. Michael Hamer becomes the immediate suspect, and they do arrest him and take him to the police station. And initially they aren't going to interview him. It's quite late at this point in the day, but Michael Hamer's own solicitor suggests that they do. I think that's important to note because it sounds to me that his own solicitor was aware what would happen if they interviewed him at that point. And when they do, Michael Hamer admits it. Again, it seems like Michael Hamer knew at this point there was no way he was going to get away with it, and that it was probably going to be far easier to just acknowledge that he'd carried out the crime because everything was going to lead back to him. The note, the teachers, the witnesses, the blood on the carpet, the forensics in the park. It was all coming for him. It was a matter of time. And again, I think this just supports what I was saying about communication skills. I don't think that Michael Hamer would have been able to have managed it. I don't think he would have been able to manage to sustain an interrogation. They are aggressive, they are long, they are exhausting. And you have to have a metal and a steel which very few of us have to sustain that kind of interrogation. And also, the chances are, his solicitor will have probably said, if you cooperate, there is a likelihood that that will be taken into consideration. So we know that Michael Hamer admits his guilt. And like I said, I think there are lots of reasons why he did that, which are basically that he's banged to rights, but also that he's not going to be anyone who can sustain that kind of interview and interrogation. And it takes quite a long time. And I know this personally because I know the case personally, and also because I have, shall we say, more inside information than most people would do. And essentially, he doesn't want to acknowledge why he did it. You know, he's quite closed. He's very embarrassed about the sexual motive. He's very embarrassed about why he actually lured Joe to his death that way. It was absolutely, without doubt, sexually motivated. As I said earlier on, that's why he got him there. He did actually say in an interview that anyone could have been his victim, but I don't believe that's true, and neither did the actual person who was prosecuting him, neither did the judge, because his suggestion was that he had these sexual fantasies. He was very uncomfortable with these sexual fantasies, and he just wanted to act them out. Remember, we talk about that a lot with psychopaths. We talk about that a lot with people who murder and sexually violate. Often they have this idea of the perfect fantasy, and because people are unpredictable, they never get to actually live that out, which often leads to more sexual depravity and fantasies. But to some degree, you have to acknowledge that Michael Hamer had gone for somebody vulnerable and small and ill. Doesn't matter what a big personality Joe had, doesn't matter what an incredible human being he was, he did not have the same level of power as another 11-year-old. I believe that Michael Hamer selected him based on that. Probably based on his popularity as well. Because here was a child who, to all intents and purposes, had more limitations than most kids, but still had lots of friends. And maybe that led, as far as Michael Hamer was concerned, to a little bit of internalized rage regarding the fact that he didn't fit in, because Michael Hamer didn't fit in. But it was shocking nonetheless when this was being prosecuted, because for the teachers and people who knew Michael Hamer, it just seemed so random, so outside of his normal behaviour. He was the person who was bullied. He was victimised at school. It was acknowledged that he would have his dinner money stolen, that he would be bullied and attacked for the way he was. So Michael Hamer was not the kind of person who was powerful. He was the opposite. He was the kid that got hurt. But again, that doesn't mean that he wasn't somebody with a predilection for danger and dangerous behaviour. That just means that he was one of those individuals that didn't connect. So again, we have this lack of connection, don't we? I want to say oddball. There are oddballs, aren't there, in this world? It's not a nice way to describe someone, I acknowledge that, but it's pretty accurate. There are just those individuals who don't really fit in, and he was one of those. One of the detectives in the case, Detective Superintendent Martin Bottomley, actually said that he felt that he specifically selected Joe, and I think we all agree that that would have been the case. You know, he was young, he was sick, and he was small and weak compared to the body that Michael Hamer had, so he was a perfect prey. Another thing that we know had happened is he'd been rejected by his peer group, rejected by individuals that would have been in his age cohort, so therefore he didn't really have any power to work out his sexual interest on people his own age. So that would have been a very big struggle for him with his identity. And we do know that he acknowledged and did discuss the fact that he'd started to have a perversion. He was really interested in younger boys. That's really important, isn't it? Because at 14, he's developing a fascination with children sexually. So that's not just about somebody who's a murderer, that's somebody who's a child molester. And I appreciate he's under the age of 18, but paedophiles and child molesters grow into adults. And certainly we're seeing an introduction, aren't we, there, into a fascination that ideally shouldn't be there. One of the things that has been discussed in psychological profiles with him is that he would go home at night and he would really ruminate and think deeply about fantasies that he could play out in his head. It was a way of controlling the world around him. It didn't feel in control. Michael Hamer didn't have control in his world. But when he was in his bedroom in the evenings, he could kind of plan these fantasies and play them out in his head. And it was a way of controlling his world, a way of controlling others within that world. An interesting insight into some of Michael Hamer's behaviour online is that he used to play a lot of games. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with that. Gamers are certainly not serial killers or in any way criminal. I'm not saying that for 1 minute. We all like gaming. What I'm saying is that it was the roles that he would play online. He would be a teacher. So he would play a role where he had power, but it shows that there is something desiring of control within his nature. He's wanting to affirm some kind of control over his world. In fact, one of the things that he'd do online was create fantasy timetables, like school timetables of where kids should be at certain times. And he'd actually put the names of children who attended the school into them. So it shows you that he's plotting and planning in his head this other world that doesn't exist. If you don't have control in your own life, you're going to seek control somewhere else. But most of us will do that positively. You know, most of us will take up a craft that we're interested in, or we'll go and do something as a team that we can connect with other people over. You know, we'll use pro-social behaviours to find that connection. We'll ask for help. That's how we should act when we don't have control in our own life. And that's not underplaying bullying. Bullying's awful. People kill themselves because they get bullied. There's no doubt about it. But Michael Hamer was badly bullied. But in the end, he became the biggest and most sinister type of bully that you could become. He became a sexual aggressor and a murderer. There is a belief that Michael Hamer selected Joe over about 3 weeks. He wanted to harm somebody. Whether he wanted to murder Joe initially, I don't know. But the way that he actually did so and then disposed of his body certainly suggests that there was a tiny line that he was walking between sexually molesting Joe and killing him. And I think that we can all agree that there was a massive detachment from the planning and composure of what he did, the rationality he seemed to have straight after the murder, the way he went to school the next day, the phone calls to his mother, the going back to the home and tidying it up, the acting normal, doing the RE homework, the just lying through it all. That in itself shows you that his conscience and empathy just is not operating where it should. In fact, his mum, who lived very locally to me, she's actually moved completely away from the area. She doesn't want anything to do with this area anymore. I mean, how could you? You couldn't, could you? You'd have to move away. You don't want to be associated with the kid who killed this innocent, lovely boy. Because Hamer admitted all the charges, it became a sentencing issue simply, which meant that when it was sentenced, he was ultimately sentenced to life with a minimum of 12 years. That was appealed and he was given an extra 3 years, so it became 15 years. Again, that's minimum. I always say that because I think we imagine that with good behaviour, somebody could get out in 10 years and so on and so forth. But often that means that it could be much longer due to the assessments that take place. If they don't think that person is safe, that person will not get out at that point. But it doesn't sound like a lot, does it? 15 years for calculating a cold execution, for disposing of a body with such clear ability, and for molesting a child. It makes me shiver a little bit that that was the case. And Michael Hamer did actually apply for his sentence to be cut short. Now, it didn't go ahead, but that worries me. It always worries me when people feel that they have a right to walk the streets earlier than their sentence allows them to, because it makes me feel that the conscience that they're meant to have isn't there. I always think that if you truly believe that you have done something wrong, you will take the punishment, you will acknowledge and accept it, and you will do it with humility. If you're not, if you want to get out earlier, have you really done the psychological work that is required to ensure that you are safe to walk the streets? And I ask that because even according to a recent assessment of him, he's still considered a high risk to children and the public. That's what the judge said when he asked to be freed. March 2021, that's right, just literally, just over a month ago, will have been the point where decisions will have been made whether he still stays behind bars. And I have tried to dig up the data on whether he is still in prison or whether he has been released and I can't find it. It has driven me mad. I doubt any of you will know, but if you do know, please do let me know too, because it is driving me a little bit crazy. I know where he went, first of all, and it wasn't a prison. It was a secure unit for young people, and it's nice. It's a place where children can be rehabilitated. It's a place where education takes place, where therapy takes place, where the staff genuinely are really nice staff, where they do their best job possible to make sure that children understand the consequences of their behaviour. I know that his behaviour was excellent when he was there. I know that he suffered from issues around depression and his mental health. I know that the bruises and bangs of his childhood that affected him will definitely have been dealt with in many ways. And I imagine that moving to a unit with adults will have been shocking, because one of the things that I used to do with young offenders was try to help them understand that the transition from being in a secure unit with young people, or even a young offenders unit, is a world away from going inside an adult prison, particularly if you're a kid who got bullied, particularly if you're a kid who got bullied and then murdered an innocent, sick child after sexually molesting them. I know that Michael Hamer tried not to get moved as early as he did to the adult prison. I know that there were attempts to make him remain in certain spaces and places because it was safer for him. And it's a difficult one, isn't it, on a conscience level? Somebody makes a lot of progress, somebody starts to appear reformed, then you're going to want to make sure that rehabilitation and restoration occurs, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to rehabilitate people for our society and community to make it safer. But again, it always comes back to that sense of, well, why do you think you deserve it easier? And I say that because, again, if you've developed the conscience to understand the horror of what you did, the enormity of the pain you caused, the consequence of taking that child's life, how could you look yourself in the mirror and want it easier? I just imagine that I'd be full of self-loathing, disgust, self-despising, because I'd have felt that what I did was just so horrific. And that isn't to say that I don't believe that children can be rehabilitated. I do. And I also believe that what marks a great society is one that can do that effectively. But if the judge was saying at the point that he was appealing that he still considered him a huge risk to children, I think we have to acknowledge that progress and improvements may have been made, but are they enough to ensure that this individual will be able to walk the streets without doing any more damage? And one of the recent research papers I've read on psychopathy, and again, I can't say that he's definitely a psychopath. I can't. I can say his actions certainly seem psychopathic. But what I can say is, if he were, one of the things that is interesting in research that I've been reading quite a lot about recently is it appears that psychopaths sometimes become more dangerous because of the rehabilitation they experience. Because they're so manipulative, they learn how to fit even better into our society. They learn how to manipulate people even more. It's a bigger game when they're getting out, and they manipulate and change and chameleon form so that they can do it effectively. I'm not saying that's the case, I'm just saying it interests me to think about that. I'm going to leave you with the weirdest part of this story. This will never happen again, I doubt, anything like this. But this is the weirdest part of the story. For me, as far as the sliding doors, the connections, me knowing so much about it, including the fact that I absolutely know that Michael Hamer is somebody who definitely has predilections for children and potentially will always pose a risk as a predator towards children, in spite of the fact that they may have worked through a lot of those issues. It still stands that for me, knowing so many intricacies about this story is still very strange. This was sent to my child, one of my kids. This was made by him. This is a box that he made in woodwork. Made by the hands of a murderer. Let's hope that he has changed. Let's hope that he has reformed. Let's hope that society doesn't end up with somebody walking around its streets who's a danger to our children. Let's hope that the services that exist really have made a difference. When social services were looked at, because there were issues, you know, he didn't necessarily get the help that his mother asked for. He didn't necessarily receive the intervention that could have made a difference. They still were not held to account. It was found that they did enough. I think the school did everything in their power. And I think that sliding doors moment of the fire alarm going off is just one of the saddest things I've ever heard of. It took me a long time to think about doing today's because I feel like I don't want to do Joe Geeling's family any disservice. You know, their son was a beautiful credit to them, and the fact that he is not breathing and Michael Hamer is will be something that I imagine is intolerable for them at times. And the fact that I can even talk about the fact that he might be free at some point will be a pain beyond measure. But this is where we are. And I will always stand by what I say. Do I believe that child killers are as terrible as adult killers? No, I don't. Do I believe that child killers can be rehabilitated? Yes, there is evidence of it. Does that mean that Michael Hamer fits that description? I don't know. I just hope that the courts of appeal and those who are treating him do. Thanks for listening. I think it's been a much more personal one today. And the reason for that is it feels more personal to me. And I wanted to do it in a way that meant it felt more personal for you. I love the fact that you watch my content. If you have spent the last hour with me, please do subscribe to my channel. Not because I put loads of work into it, and not because I just, you know, really, really want your subscriptions, but because I really enjoy doing it. And it's lovely the fact that it's growing. I want to say thanks to all of you. Thanks to every single person who's subscribed. I've only been doing this, you know, weeks as far as crime is concerned, and just watching my numbers go up, I'm really surprised. It's like a bit mind-blowing for me. I love the fact that you guys tune in. I've done TV for like 14 years and I've done crime for all these years, and I've never been as liberated as I have been in being able to tell these stories. I can just say what I want and do what I want, and no one can edit me out. And I'm gonna make mistakes, and I invite your criticism, and I'm gonna tell you things that are difficult to hear, and you're gonna tell me stories that I wanna hear too. So be aware that, you know, I read your comments, and there are lots of them, and it blows my mind as well, and I really appreciate them. Also, cheers for all the comments on my t-shirts, because, you know, on TV I don't get to wear normal clothes. I have to look like somebody on TV, but I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And when I'm getting called Queen of Crime and things like that, I love it, although sometimes it does sound like I actually am a queen of crime, which would probably pay better than right now in my life. But don't do it, kids. Don't do crime. I'll see you same time, same place, same space next Sunday. And remember, if you need any well-being stuff, I've got a free app called Appy. Go on the Play Store and the App Store. It's completely free forever. It's got loads of advice, guidance, help and well-being advice and nutrition advice and recipes and meal plans and every exercise program you could ever imagine. Clearly it's not me doing it, but the point is you may as well get that too. Take care. See you next Sunday.